And we have another speaker, Benedikt Bünz from Espresso Systems, who will present to us Hyperplonk, linear time and parallelizable Plonk with custom gates. Welcome, Benedikt. Actually, quite early welcome, in fact.
Yeah. Do I get a mic? Or...
Yep.
The slides?
Hello?
No.
Oh. All right.
You have the right slide.
Ooh.
I mean, we could do PowerPoint karaoke, and I'll talk about... Yeah, that looks more like it.
There we go.
Cool. Thank you very much. Yeah. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I'm competing now with a real party downstairs, apparently, so that will make it harder to get attendance. But yeah, thanks, everybody, for coming. And I'm going to talk today about something brand new that we haven't talked about before. So maybe the slides are a little bit rougher, but it's, you're seeing something for the very first time, which is Hyperplonk, which is a new zero-knowledge proof system, which, as the name suggests, is based on Plonk, but has some really exciting properties, removes the need for something called fast Fourier transform, and enables high-degree gates, which is especially going to make it more useful for large parallelism and trying to prove things about really, really large statements. And this is joint work with Binyi Chen, Dan Bonet from Stanford, and Zhenfei Zhang from also Espresso Systems. And yeah, this is work that we did at Espresso Systems. Okay. Does this work? Okay, cool. So what is Hyperplonk? Hyperplonk is a new polynomial IOP, which is a key component. I'll talk a little bit in a second about what polynomial IOPs are, but it can be combined with any sort of polynomial commitment scheme. So KZG's polynomial commitment scheme, something like bulletproofs, something FRI-based, and if you combine them, you get a new different snark. And depending on what polynomial commitment scheme you use, you get different properties for the snark. And it is Plonk-based, but instead of Plonk uses univariate, the big difference is that Plonk uses univariate polynomials and encodes things over a subgroup, versus we use multilinear, so-called multilinear polynomials, and Hyperplonk is based over the so-called Boolean hypercube, which is where the name comes from. I'll explain all of these things in more details, but this is just the overview of the features. And one thing that we made ensure that one of the reasons why we built Hyperplonk is because we wanted to have all of the nice features of Plonk, such as custom gates and lookup. I think this is TurboPlonk and UltraPlonk. If I get the order wrong, I'm really sorry. Also Halo 2 arithmetization, but all of the cool features and the tooling that has developed around the Plonk proof system, which has been really rapidly adopted, are things that we wanted to maintain. But additionally, we wanted to remove the need for these FFTs. And the reason is that these FFTs, they basically become a bottleneck if you're trying to use a lot of parallelism or if you're trying to use prove really, really large instances. They have so-called superlinear scaling, and we wanted to remove the need for that, and that is exactly what we did. Additionally, we support really not just normal custom gates, but more complicated custom gates, so-called high-degree custom gates. In particular, if you, unlike in Plonk, if you have a custom gate and you make it too large, you basically pay for it in terms of group operations. And in Hyperplonk, you only need to, the higher degree or the more complicated your custom gate becomes, you still have to pay for it, but you pay for it in so-called field operations, which are much, much cheaper than group operations. So in effect, this allows you to use more complicated custom gates. And the proof size is a little bit larger than Plonk. So it is, Plonk is, maybe less than a kilobyte. Oh, it's definitely less than a kilobyte. And for Hyperplonk, the proof size is about 4 log n plus some constant, and roughly it's like less than 4 kilobytes if your proof is about 1 million constraints. So what are these? Plonk is a poly IOP, or PIOP. What is a polynomial IOP? Well, to understand that, we need to understand how a lot of these modern snarks are built. And they're basically built from 2 ingredients. One of them is this polynomial IOP, and the other one is a polynomial commitment scheme. and this gives you a ZK snark. And this really general paradigm, so instances of polynomial IOPs are Plonk, Sonic, Marlin, Libra, and instances of polynomial commitment schemes are things like KZG, you can build one from bulletproofs, there's Fry-based commitment schemes, Dark, and so on and so forth. And the really cool thing about this general paradigm for constructing snarks is that you can essentially take any of the things from the left side and any of the things from the right side and get a new snark. And the properties are sort of the combined properties of both of these things. And this talk will focus on the left side on these polynomial IOPs. So what we're doing in a polynomial IOP, if you think about it, what you want to think about is that we have some arithmetic circuit. So this is a circuit that consists of, say, addition and multiplication gates, and maybe some additional gates that we'll talk about later. And the proof system wants to show that the proof system, that the circuit is satisfiable. What this means is that given some public inputs x, there exists, we want to prove that there exists some private witnesses W such that the circuit, the final gate of the circuit is equal to 0, for example. And the way that we do that is using this polynomial IOP. And in the polynomial IOP, the prover sends some commitment, sends in every round some polynomial or some polynomials. In the simplified version, there's only one. And then the verifier sends back some challenges. And you do this for multiple rounds. And then at the end, the verifier can check the proof system by evaluating the polynomials at a few points. So this proof system is, we can design this proof system, and Hyperplonk is such a proof system, but by itself it's not very efficient because these polynomials may be large. And what we then do to make this into a snark is that instead of sending the polynomials, you send a polynomial commitment. Instead, the verifier evaluating the polynomials directly, it will evaluate or it will receive a proof. The prover will basically assist the verifier. So the prover will claim that the polynomial has some correct value and then give a sort of an evaluation proof that this polynomial was evaluated correctly. But the question that we're concerned with today is how do we design these polynomial IOPs? And the properties that we want from the polynomial IOPs are kind of standard properties that we have in snarks. So completeness means that an honest prover can convince an honest verifier. Knowledge soundness means that if a prover constructs a convincing proof, then he must have known a witness. So formally you can, or a little bit more formally, it means you can extract a witness. And then optionally, something that I will not talk a lot today about is zero knowledge. So zero knowledge means that the proof itself reveals no information about the witness. And the resulting snark of this compilation basically depends on depends mainly on the number of polynomials that we send and the number of queries that we make to these polynomials. And I'll skip over this a little bit, but the important thing is that kind of the cryptographic assumption that you use, so whether this proof, for example, is post-quantum secure or whether it requires pairings, that only depends on the polynomial commitment scheme we use. So if you use Fry, you get something that is plausibly post-quantum resistant. If you use pairings, you get something that if you use KZG, you get something that requires pairings, but maybe has a shorter proof size. The poly IOP, though, is really the way that we encode the circuit. So it defines really also how we think about our computation. And to start out, I want to talk about a little bit at a high level how Plonk works. So in Plonk, we start with some circuit that has addition and multiplication gates. And there's some public inputs x to the circuit and some private inputs w. And it turns out that you can represent the circuit always as a multivariate polynomial of all of the inputs and witnesses. And the question is that we want to, and if we have some private, some inputs, so 5, 6, and 1, then we can simply evaluate the circuit by going down the wires. So, for example, this last wire is 11 times 7 is 77. And then the circuit would basically prove that, that there exists a private input such that this output evaluates to 77. And what Plonk does is it takes the circuit and it looks at the computation trace. So it looks at the trace of all of these gates and writes basically a row per gate. So it has some inputs and a claimed output, and then we repeat the inputs as the gate 0, and additionally with the witness, and then we write every single gate here, and the first line is the left input to the gate, the second line is the right input to the gate, and the third line is the output of the gate. So for example, gate 1 is an addition gate, so 6 plus 1 is equal to 7. And the final thing, the bottom right corner, is the output of the circuit. So what Plonk does is it encodes the circuit, this computation trace, as a polynomial. So what we do is we take some polynomial that and interpolate it to be the entire computation trace. So let's see how this works. So what we do is we have some values w, and these values w need to have some specific structure, but that's not as w omega. It's Greek letters. So we take these values omega to the power of j for j or L from 0 to the size of the circuit. And what we do is always we make sure that the 3 neighboring values always represent one row. So w to the 3L would represent, for example, the value 6 here. W3L plus 1 would be 1, and W3L plus 2 is 7. So the neighboring values always represent one of the rows of the polynomial. So, and to do this, to interpolate this polynomial, the prover has to use something called an FFT, a fast Fourier transform, to do this. And this takes d log d time, which in practice this is not a problem if d is small, or n, actually n log n time. In practice, it's not a problem if n is small, but it does actually become a bottleneck if n gets large, and this is what we're going to try to get rid of. So in our example, this is what, for example, this encoding would look like, and the number of points that you encode exactly corresponds to the degree of the polynomial. So the degree in this case is, I guess, 11. So the 10,000 feet or 3,048 meter view of how this proof system works is that the prover encodes the correct. We need to prove 4 different things. The first thing that we need to show then, given this polynomial with the PRP, is that the prover encodes the correct inputs. So that the first row, that these inputs correspond to 5, 6, and 1. The second thing is that every gate is evaluated correctly. So that, for example, here, this is a correct addition gate, that 6 plus 1 is equal to 7. The third thing is that the wiring is correct. So you see that a lot of values here are repeated. So for example, this input on the right side is the same as the left input on here, and you need to actually prove that that is done correctly. And then finally, the last thing is just that the output is whatever the prover, whatever we think it should be. So that the output here, 77, is actually 77. So the way to do that is like this. It's a complicated, or it's actually not that complicated, but it uses many different subprotocols. And if you want to understand it, you have to understand the subprotocols, which then build up to the full protocol. And then there's also Plonk, which does something called lookups, which I'm not going to talk about today. But the things that I want to focus on a little bit, because they become important in Hyperplonk, are these 3 components: the quotient check, the zero check, and the circuit check. And they're very, very related to each other. So how do I prove that? I want to prove this second component. I want to prove that every gate is evaluated correctly. So this is the so-called circuit check. So the way that I do that is by having this selector polynomial, which is either 0 or 1. And it's 1 if I have an addition gate, and it's 0 if I have a multiplication gate. And the way that Plonk proves that the circuit is evaluated correctly is by saying that, well, either I have an addition gate, so then py plus pw times y is equal to pw squared times y, or I have a multiplication gate, then py times pw omega times y is equal to p omega squared y. And the selector basically is 1 if it's an addition gate here, or it's 0 if it's a multiplication gate. So only this part will be active or this part will be active. And if this is too complicated, don't worry about it. We'll go a little bit higher level soon. But basically the way that I prove this is I basically need to prove this equation here at every single point for every single value of omega. For every single value of omega in this kind of subspace. And this is called, we can think of this abstractly as saying there's some polynomial f, and we need to prove that it's 0 over a bunch of different things. So this is the so-called zero check. And the way that we do that is by showing that by doing a so-called quotient check. Again, we don't need to worry about the details here. But all of this, to make this work, we have to look at this polynomial f as a univariate polynomial. And in particular, we have to construct this polynomial f or p. And the way that we do that is in FFT. So this is a fast Fourier transform. And this has some downside. I already mentioned that it runs in time n log n. So it's not linear in n, it's super linear. So for example, if n is like 25, then this grows by, there's an extra factor of 25 that you're paying here. It additionally requires a so-called FFT-friendly field, which restricts our choices of fields and makes things less nice. And also, it has a bunch of memory accesses. To actually implement this, there's a bunch of complex memory accesses, and it's really hard to parallelize, or it's difficult to parallelize beyond a certain point. And all of these things make it really... It's okay if n is not that big, like if n is like, I don't know, 2 to the 15 or like 10,000, then this is not a problem. But once n gets large, and especially if you use parallelism, then this becomes a big bottleneck, and especially becomes a bottleneck if you're trying to implement things, say, on a GPU. So in Hyperplonk, we want to get rid of this FFT. This is the main goal. We want to get rid of this FFT. So instead of interpolating, so our idea is that instead of using this subspace of some field and using high-degree polynomials, we're going to use so-called multivariate polynomials over the Boolean hypercube. So instead of evaluating things at w, we're going to add some variables and then interpolate things basically at just 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, and this is the Boolean hypercube. It's just values of 0, 1 and combinations thereof. And how many variables do I need in order to interpolate n points? Well, I need log n variables because there's 2 to the number of variables combinations. So I need, for example, here I have, I guess, I have 4 variables, so I could encode up to 16 different things with it. And the polynomial that results in it turns out that it has 4 variables, but it turns out that we can design a polynomial that is linear in every single variable. So it has many, many different terms. It has, this one has, for example, 16 terms, but there's no x4 squared term here, right? It's linear in every single variable, and this actually makes it very efficient and enables some of the other protocols that we're using. It turns out also that we then, right, so we need to, if we want to use these multivariate or multilinear polynomials, we need a commitment scheme that supports it. Well, it turns out, fortunately, that there is a bunch. And so, for example, there's a KZG-based commitment scheme that it looks very similar to KZG that we can use here, but you can also use something Frye-based, bulletproof, story, and so on and so forth. The proof size here usually is there's a factor of log n that you pay. So the proofs are usually slightly bigger. This is why also the bulletproofs, the proof size is a little bit larger than normal Plonk. So how do we do this? Well, we want to remove the FFT, right? Like this, I've just said we're interpolating this polynomial differently, but still the question is how do we do this FFT? Well, the idea is that we're actually not going to instantiate this polynomial at all. We'll just keep the polynomial in this so-called evaluation form, and then we'll design protocols, or we'll use protocols that work with this evaluation form. And in particular, we want to make this zero check work. We want to prove that some polynomial is 0 over this entire space. And the old zero check just doesn't really work. There's not really a quotient check for these multilinear polynomials. But it turns out that we can use this other beautiful protocol that's been around for quite some time, called the sum check protocol. One of the first, really efficient proof protocols that existed at all. And the sum check protocol, we'll look at that in a second, gives us exactly what we want. And additionally, one of the difficulties that we have to do is that the circuit argument requires a shift. What do I mean by that? Well, we need to access P of y here, and we also need to access P of w times y. And why do we do that? Well, we need to, in every row, access one element and its right neighbor, and then its right neighbor, right? We need to always access like 3 things that are next to each other in the thing, in our computation trace. And in univariate Plonk, this works really easily, or it works very nicely. I have to just multiply my variable by omega. The problem is that the shift is not really obvious, right? There's not really some obvious thing that I can multiply this 0, 0, 0 with to get 0, 0, 1. It's not quite clear how I iterate through the space. It turns out, though, that in the circuit argument, this is fine. If you look at this closely, if you look at these 2 variables, the way that we laid out things here is that the first variable always ends with 0, 0, the second variable ends with 0, 1, and the third variable ends with 1, 0. And we can use exactly this fact to access the right constraints. Still, though, this lack of shift is a problem for lookup and fancy kind of Halo 2 gates. And we also have a way of kind of implementing such a shift. I might get to it later. So if we look at the large, or the high-level view of how Hyperplonk works, or what it looks like, it actually looks fairly similar to Plonk. It's just that we replace some of the components. So importantly, we replace the quotient check with the sum check protocol, and we also have to change, for example, things like the product check and the lookup check, because now it's not a product over H anymore, it's a product over this hypercube. So let's focus on the sum check protocol. So what is the sum check protocol? Well, the sum check protocol proves that I have some polynomial f of x, right, which might have up to 2 to the mu coefficients. And in fact, actually, it can be multivariate, so it might have even more coefficients, or it might be really complicated. By multivariate, I mean it's more than multilinear. It's, for example, the product of multilinears. And I want to prove that the sum over all of the things in the Boolean hypercube of this polynomial is equal to 0. So how do I use this to prove the circuit formula? Well, really, I want to prove that, right, again, this P of x, 0, 0, I want to prove this gate formula. But I want to prove it at every single point in the space. So I'm multiplying this by this EQ thing. And the easiest way to think about this EQ thing is it's a random linear combination. It's a random linear combination of all of my gates. And what this does is it ensures that the only way to satisfy this formula with high probability is if every single gate is satisfied. So this would prove, so if I can prove this sum here, right, which is yet another, like this is just a more complicated way. I can replace this becomes my f of x, and then I can prove that then basically this gives me a 0 check. So the way that the sum check protocol works is that the prover and verifier proceed in rounds, so it's a poly IOP, and in every round the prover sends some mu degree, the prover sends in total, so there's mu rounds, and in every round it sends 1 degree d univariate polynomials. So d here is the degree of f. And what is the degree of f? Well, I know that all of these things are linear. So p is linear, p is again linear, p is linear, and eq actually is also linear. So I got 1 times 1 times 1, so the degree is 3. So it sends a degree 3 polynomial in every round. And the prover runs in time 2 to the mu times d squared, so this would be 9, so 2 to the mu times 9. And recall that 2 to the mu is exactly the size of our circuit. But the verifier runs, right, on only O of mu, so it runs in time logarithmic of the size of the circuit. So it turns out that this protocol actually very nicely adapts itself to custom gates. So what is a custom gate, or what is this high degree custom gate? If this is our circuit formula, well, I have multiplications here and I have additions here. But really, there's not a lot that binds this to be just multiplications and addition. I could have a gate that implements, left input to the power of 5 plus y. And there's basically this more general formulation here where I say that there's just multiple gates, and this gate can be a higher degree formula which implements some more complex operations. So think, for example, if I want to implement some elliptic curve addition, then I can implement this with a higher degree custom gate. So the problem in Plonk, so why would I want to use these custom gates at all? Well, if I use more complex custom gates, then actually I can decrease the number of gates that I have. So it decreases the size of the witness, which decreases the group operations. So that's good. Unfortunately, in Plonk, though, there's this quotient check, and you have to trust me here that it increases the degree of the quotient polynomials, which on the other hand increases the number of group operations. So basically, it gives you something, but it also takes something. And in effect, what this means is that Plonk only really works for custom gates up to a factor of 5. I'll do 2 more slides and then I can stop. In Hyperplonk, I can only do custom gates up to a constant factor. In Plonk, sorry. In Hyperplonk, we want to go beyond that. And the interesting observation is that in Hyperplonk, the gates only affect the sum check. But the sum check is only field operations. So it doesn't require any sort of commitments. There's almost no additional things being sent. It's just field operations. So it does increase the number of field operations that are being done, but it decreases the number of group operations. And this is really interesting because group operations are about 1,000 times more expensive than field operations. Unfortunately, though, the dependence in classic sum check in the degree of the custom gate is basically quadratic. So you still can't go too far if you do that. And additionally, the proof size and the verifier time also increase linearly in D. And what we do is we do a couple optimizations around that. So for example, we build a sum check where the prover time is not D squared anymore, but it's D log squared D, which is smaller than D squared. There again, we do resort to some FFTs, but some really small ones, right? They're only over D, not over 2 to the mu. And also the proof size and the verifier dependence on D, we basically are able to completely remove that by simply committing to the polynomials that are being sent in every round. And for the last slide, take these numbers with a massive grain of salt. These are very preliminary numbers, especially the absolute ones. But the interesting thing to see here is that you see a bunch of lines which are over almost the same. And why is this interesting? Well, these lines represent different high-degree custom gates. So there's degree 1, degree 2, degree 4, degree 8, degree 16. And it almost doesn't affect the proof size. So we're able to do higher degree custom gates up to 16. We don't know yet quite how far we can push it. At some point, there is a cost to it. Also, the question is what custom gates are still useful. But the thing that we expect is that it doesn't affect the proof size, which is exactly what we want. So yeah, thank you very much. And if I have time, I'm here for questions.
Hello, hello. Okay, yeah, I think there's one question, and I think there's really only time for one question. All right.
Hi, it's Dmitry. Thank you for a great talk. About the FFT, you say no FFTs. Is there a particular reason you want to use it without FFTs? You want to use it for huge domains or something?
Yeah, exactly. For example, for ZK EVM, right? You want to, the circuits that people estimate is like 2 to the 30 size circuits, right? So we're getting into, applications that require really, really large circuits. And so that is one reason. And I think the other reason that is tightly related to it, and And we're talking to some people about, like supranational, about having a GPU implementation of this. Is that for hardware implementations? I think ZK proof systems, now we've shut down all the mining for Ethereum. Like now, hopefully, people can invest their hardware and resources into something better, ZK proof systems. And I think we're gonna have really beautiful snarks, ASICs for these proof systems soon. And FFTs make this much harder. So removing this makes it much more feasible and hopefully gives you a lot more benefit when you implement this on hardware.
Very cool. Thank you, Benedikt.
Thank you.